This is a true story of how mass murder became a banking transaction. In the heart of Berlin, inside the imposing marble halls of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, clerks in pressed suits received deliveries from the SS marked with innocent-sounding code names like Melmer and Max Heiliger. Inside the crates, wedding rings torn from fingers at Auschwitz, gold dental fillings pried from corpses by prisoners forced to do the unthinkable, watches that had stopped ticking in gas chambers, and jewelry that mothers had hidden in their children's clothes, hoping it might buy their survival. These bankers, ordinary men and women with families, mortgages, and weekend hobbies, weighed the items on precision scales, melted them in industrial furnaces, and entered them into official ledgers as if they were processing routine state assets. They turned genocide into gold bars stamped with the Reichsbank logo, erasing every trace of the human beings those objects had once belonged to. After the war, Allied investigators found the paperwork, interrogated the bankers, and discovered a truth more chilling than any battlefield atrocity. Some of history's worst crimes are committed not in rage or hatred, but in quiet offices by people who believe they are simply doing their jobs. What you're about to hear is the story of the Melmer gold, the bureaucrats who laundered it, and the question that haunts us still. How do ordinary people become accomplices to evil when all they have to do is look away? The Reichsbank, a temple of German respectability. The Reichsbank wasn't a sinister fortress. It was one of the most prestigious institutions in Europe, a massive neoclassical building on Jägerstrasse in central Berlin, with marble columns, vaulted ceilings, and brass chandeliers that reflected the soft light of desk lamps. Before the Nazis came to power in 1933, it had been Germany's central bank, managing the nation's currency, gold reserves, and international trade with the kind of meticulous professionalism expected of a world-class financial institution. When Hitler seized control, the Reichsbank didn't collapse or resist. It adapted. Many of its employees stayed on. Senior bankers, accountants, clerks, secretaries, security guards. They were career professionals, not political zealots. They had families to feed, pensions to protect, and careers they had spent decades building. And as the Nazi regime tightened its grip on every aspect of German life, these employees made a calculation. It was safer, easier, and more profitable to stay than to leave. By 1942, the Reichsbank had become something far darker than a bank. It had become a laundromat, a place where the stolen wealth of murdered Jews was washed clean, turned into anonymous gold bars, and deposited into Germany's official reserves, or sold to neutral countries to buy war materials. Imagine walking into the Reichsbank on a Tuesday morning in 1943. You'd see men in three-piece suits carrying leather briefcases, women in neat secretarial dresses typing at desks, security guards checking identification cards at the entrance. You'd hear the quiet hum of typewriters, the shuffle of paper, the occasional ring of a telephone. It looked like any bank in any city, orderly, respectable, boring. But if you walked down the marble staircase to the basement vaults, you'd see something else entirely. Wooden crates stacked against the walls, some still sealed with SS stamps. Technicians in white coats sorting through piles of jewelry. Furnaces glowing orange-red as gold melted into liquid pools. And clerks, ordinary-looking people with tired faces, weighing dental fillings on precision scales and recording the weights in leather-bound ledgers. One Reichsbank employee, interrogated by American investigators after the war, described his first day working in the vault. "I was told my job was simple. Open the crates, sort the contents by type, gold, silver, currency, jewelry, and weigh everything. I asked my supervisor where it came from. He looked at me and said, 'You don't want to know, and if you value your job, you won't ask again.' So I didn't." That was how it worked. Don't ask, don't question, just do your job. The Melmer deliveries, what came in the crates. The systematic deliveries of Holocaust loot to the Reichsbank began in earnest in the summer of 1942, following the implementation of Aktion Reinhard, the Nazi code name for the mass murder of Jews in occupied Poland and the seizure of all their property. The policy was brutally clear. Nothing was to be wasted. Clothing, shoes, suitcases, even hair, everything was to be collected, sorted, and repurposed for the German war effort. But certain items had special value, gold, jewelry, foreign currency, and precious metals. These were to be sent directly to the Reichsbank for processing. The man responsible for organizing these shipments was SS Hauptsturmführer Bruno Melmer, an officer in the SS Economic Administration Division. Melmer's job was logistical: collect the valuables from the death camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, pack them into wooden crates, and deliver them by truck to the Reichsbank in Berlin. The deliveries became known as the Melmer shipments, and they arrived with disturbing regularity, sometimes weekly, sometimes multiple times per week, depending on the pace of killing. Inside the crates, Reichsbank employees found wedding rings, thousands of them, many still inscribed with names, dates, and loving messages in German, Polish, Hungarian, and Yiddish. Some rings had been worn so long they had left grooves in the metal. Others were bent or broken, torn off fingers in haste. Gold dental fillings, pried from the mouths of corpses by camp prisoners known as the Sonderkommando, Jews forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria, pulling bodies apart and extracting anything of value before the remains were burned. The fillings often arrived in cloth bags, still stained with blood and tissue. Watches and pocket watches, frozen at the exact moment their owners had died. Some had stopped at 3 o'clock p.m., others at midnight, recording the final seconds of lives that would never be remembered. Jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, brooches, earrings, rings set with diamonds and sapphires, items that had been family heirlooms, passed down through generations, now reduced to weight and purity measurements in a ledger. Foreign currency and coins, carried by victims who had believed, until the very end, that they were being resettled, not murdered, and that they might need money to start over in a new place. Religious items, silver mezuzahs, Torah crowns, candlesticks used for Sabbath prayers, sacred objects, now weighed and melted like scrap metal. The scale was staggering. Between 1942 and 1944, the Melmer account at the Reichsbank received shipments valued at over 178 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to several $billion in today's money. And that was just what was officially logged. Much more was stolen by camp guards, SS officers, or lost in the chaos of war. One technician, assigned to sort through the jewelry, later testified, "I opened a crate once and found children's rings, tiny things, small enough for a 5-year-old. I held one in my hand and thought, this belonged to a child. Then I put it on the scale and wrote down the weight. That's all I did. I weighed it, and I went home that night and had dinner with my own children." The Max Heiliger account, Himmler's secret ledger. The loot couldn't simply be deposited into a normal account. It needed to be hidden, laundered, and given a false veneer of legitimacy. So the SS opened a special account at the Reichsbank under the code name Max Heiliger, a fake name randomly chosen designed to obscure the true source of the deposits. The account was controlled by the SS, specifically by Heinrich Himmler's Economic Administration Office, the SS Wirtschafts- und Verwaltungshauptamt, WVHA. Officially, it was described in internal memos as holding miscellaneous state assets. In reality, it was a repository for the plundered wealth of Holocaust victims. Here's how the system worked, step by step. 1. Delivery. The Melmer shipments arrived at the Reichsbank by truck, usually in the early morning or late evening to avoid public attention. The crates were unloaded at a secure entrance, accompanied by SS guards who signed delivery receipts and handed them to Reichsbank officials. 2. Sorting. Reichsbank employees opened the crates in a basement sorting room. The contents were separated by category: gold items, rings, fillings, jewelry, silver items, foreign currency, watches, and miscellaneous valuables. 3. Weighing and logging. Each category was weighed on precision scales. The weights were recorded in official ledgers under the account number for Max Heiliger. Every transaction was documented: date, weight, estimated value, and a brief description. The paperwork was meticulous, bureaucratic, and horrifyingly routine. 4. Melting. Gold items, wedding rings, dental fillings, jewelry were sent to the Reichsbank's smelting facility. There, a technician heated a furnace to over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The items were dumped into a crucible and melted into a molten pool. Within minutes, everything, rings inscribed with love, fillings that had once been part of living people, bracelets given as birthday gifts, became a shapeless liquid. The liquid gold was poured into molds, creating standardized bars weighing approximately 12.5 kilograms each. Each bar was stamped with the Reichsbank logo, a serial number, and a purity mark. It was now official gold, indistinguishable from bars refined from legitimate ore, untraceable to its origins. 5. Crediting. The value of the melted gold and other assets was credited to the Max Heiliger account. The SS could then draw on this account to fund its operations, paying for weapons, supplies, bribes, and the expansion of the concentration camp system itself. It was a closed loop: murder, theft, processing, laundering, profit. And every step was documented, stamped, and filed away in neat ledgers that would later become evidence of one of history's most systematic financial crimes. One historian, reviewing the Reichsbank records after the war, wrote, "What struck me wasn't the scale, though that was enormous. It was the normalcy. These weren't wild, chaotic scribbles. These were clean, professional ledgers, the kind you'd see in any bank. The genocide had been turned into accounting. The process. A day in the life of a Reichsbank clerk." Let me walk you through what happened on a typical day when a Melmer shipment arrived. It's a Wednesday morning in October 1943. The air in Berlin is cold and damp. A truck pulls up to the rear entrance of the Reichsbank at 7 o'clock a.m. before most of the staff have arrived. 2 SS guards step out and unlock the back. Inside, 6 wooden crates, each stamped with the SS lightning bolt insignia. A Reichsbank official, a man named Franz, signs the delivery papers. He's 42 years old, a career banker who's been with the Reichsbank since 1928. He has a wife and 2 daughters. He commutes from a modest apartment in Charlottenburg. He's nervous about the Allied bombing raids, which have been getting worse, but otherwise his life is unremarkable. Franz oversees the unloading of the crates. They're heavy. Each one takes 2 men to carry. The crates are brought down the marble staircase to the basement sorting room, a windowless space lit by harsh overhead bulbs. The door is locked behind them. Franz's team begins. There are 6 people, 4 men, 2 women. They've done this dozens of times. No one speaks much. The work is repetitive and grim. They open the first crate. Inside, piles of rings, tangled together like metal spaghetti. One of the clerks, a woman named Helga, uses gloved hands to separate them. She places the gold rings in one tray, the silver rings in another. She's been doing this for 8 months. She no longer flinches. Another clerk, a man named Otto, weighs the gold rings on a balance scale. He records the weight in a ledger. October 13th, 1943. Delivery, num. 47. Gold rings, 8.2 kilograms. The rings are placed in a canvas sack and sent to the smelting room upstairs. There, a technician named Klaus, a metal worker who used to make jewelry before the war, loads the rings into a crucible and slides it into the furnace. The heat is intense. Within minutes, the rings melt. Klaus pours the molten gold into a mold. It cools into a bar. He stamps it with the Reichsbank seal. By noon, the 6 crates have been processed. The gold has been melted. The silver has been sorted. The foreign currency has been counted and deposited. Franz files the paperwork and locks the ledger in a safe. At 1 o'clock p.m., he goes to lunch. He eats a sandwich, drinks a cup of ersatz coffee, and reads the newspaper. There's an article about the Eastern Front. He wonders if his cousin, who's in the Wehrmacht, is still alive. At 2 o'clock p.m., he returns to his desk. There are more transactions to process, more paperwork to file. The Melmer shipments are just one part of his job. Franz doesn't think of himself as a criminal. He's a banker. He's doing his job. He's following orders. He's keeping the system running. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying part of all. The post-war discovery. Allies find the paper trail. When the war ended in May 1945 and Allied forces occupied Berlin, one of their first priorities was securing German financial institutions. The Reichsbank was near the top of the list. American and British investigators entered the building expecting to find gold reserves, foreign currency, and perhaps some evidence of wartime financial crimes. What they found was far worse: a complete, meticulously documented record of how the Nazi regime had turned genocide into a profit center. The ledgers were intact. The Melmer shipment logs were clear. The Max Heiliger account statements laid out in brutal detail how the SS had deposited the wealth of murdered Jews, wedding rings, dental fillings, jewelry, and withdrawn funds to finance its operations. One American investigator, a captain named Robert, later wrote in his report, "I've seen battlefields, I've seen camps, but reading those ledgers, seeing genocide reduced to line items in an accountant's book with neat handwriting and rubber stamps, that shook me in a way nothing else had. It showed how deeply the rot went. These weren't just soldiers following orders. These were bankers, clerks, ordinary professionals, acting like this was normal business." The investigators began interrogating Reichsbank officials. Among them, Emil Pohl, vice president of the Reichsbank, and the man who had personally overseen many of the Melmer transactions. Pohl was a career banker, educated, cultured, and outwardly respectable. When asked if he knew the origin of the gold, he claimed he had suspicions, but no direct knowledge. He admitted he had seen dental fillings and understood what they implied, but insisted he had no authority to refuse SS deliveries. "I was a banker, not a policeman," he said. "My job was to manage the bank's operations, not to question state policy." Albert Toms, the chief cashier who had directly handled the shipments and supervised the sorting and smelting, Toms testified that he had simply followed orders and that refusing would have endangered his life and career. "What was I supposed to do?" he asked. "Say no to the SS? I had a family. I had responsibilities." Franz, Helga, Otto, Klaus, and dozens of other clerks and technicians who had weighed, sorted, melted, and logged the loot. Almost all of them gave similar testimony. They were just doing their jobs. They had no choice. They didn't make the policy. They were small cogs in a machine they didn't control. But the records told a different story. These men and women hadn't been coerced at gunpoint. They had clocked in, done their work with professional competence, clocked out, and gone home to their families. They had received paychecks, taken vacations, celebrated birthdays and holidays. And every day they had chosen to come back. Trials and weak punishments. Justice denied. In the post-war trials, a few Reichsbank officials were prosecuted, but the punishments were shockingly light, almost insulting to the victims. Emil Pohl was tried at Nuremberg in 1949 as part of the ministry's case. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to 5 years in prison. But he served less than 3 years before being released. After his release, he worked as a banking consultant and lived comfortably in West Germany until his death in 1962. Albert Toms was tried by a German denazification court and sentenced to a few years in prison. He was released early for good behavior and returned to private life, eventually finding work in the financial sector again. Most of the lower-level clerks, technicians, and secretaries were never prosecuted at all. They simply went back to work, many of them in banks, accounting firms, or government offices, as if nothing had happened. The reasons for the leniency were complex. Cold War politics. The Western Allies needed West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Prosecuting too many Germans could destabilize the new state. Legal challenges. Proving individual culpability in a system crime was difficult. Defense lawyers argued that their clients had no personal intent to commit murder. They had simply processed paperwork. A desire to move on. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, there was a strong political and social push to put the past behind and focus on rebuilding. But the result was a profound failure of justice. The people who had turned Holocaust, loot into state assets, who had weighed wedding rings and logged dental fillings as routine transactions, faced little to no consequences for their actions. One survivor, learning of Pohl's sentence, said, 5 years, that's what my family's lives were worth to them. 5 years for a man who turned my mother's wedding ring into a gold bar. That's not justice, that's an insult. The banality of evil. Bureaucrats as murderers. The Reichsbank case is one of the clearest examples of what philosopher Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. The idea that great crimes are often committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who see themselves as simply doing their jobs. The Reichsbank clerks weren't sadists. They didn't personally kill anyone. They didn't design gas chambers or run death camps. But they were essential to the machinery of genocide. Without them, the SS couldn't have laundered stolen wealth. Without them, the connection between murder and profit would have been harder to sustain. And they did it all from behind desks, with scales and ledgers and rubber stamps, using the polite, bureaucratic language of banking to turn horror into paperwork. Think about what that means. Think about how easy it is to participate in something monstrous when your role is small and technical, far removed from the violence. You're told it's state policy and not your place to question. You're rewarded for competence and punished for disobedience. Everyone around you is doing the same thing, normalizing the abnormal. One historian put it bluntly: the Reichsbank clerks are a warning to all of us. They show that you don't have to be a fanatic to enable atrocities. You just have to be willing to do your job without asking where it leads or who it harms. And that's a trap any of us could fall into if we're not careful. The gold that was never recovered. After the war, much of the looted gold was never recovered. Some had been sold to neutral countries, Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, Spain, during the war, and was difficult or impossible to trace. Some had been hidden by fleeing Nazis and remains lost to this day. Some was recovered by the Allies and eventually distributed to international restitution funds, though the amounts paid to survivors and heirs were a tiny fraction of what had been stolen. The Reichsbank's meticulous records helped investigators identify some of the loot, but the records were incomplete, destroyed in bombings, hidden, or deliberately purged. And even when gold was recovered, proving that a specific bar had come from a specific victim was nearly impossible, because the melting process had erased all identifying marks. Today, some of that gold may still be circulating in bank vaults, jewelry stores, or private collections, its dark history unknown to its current owners. Closing questions and call to action. Many of you have written to tell me that the stories of financial crimes and bureaucratic complicity are the ones that challenge you most, because they force us to ask uncomfortable questions about ourselves and the systems we live in. The Reichsbank clerks weren't evil masterminds. They were people with jobs, families, and mortgages, and they chose every day to process the stolen wealth of murdered people because it was easier than refusing, questioning, or walking away. But I want to ask you, first, if you had been a clerk at the Reichsbank in 1943 and you opened a crate full of wedding rings and dental fillings, what would you have done? Would you have quit, stayed silent, or convinced yourself it wasn't your responsibility? Second, do you think the Reichsbank officials deserved harsher punishments, or was the decision to go easy on them justified by the need to rebuild Germany after the war? And third, what does the Melmer Gold teach us about the systems we work in today? How do we make sure we're not becoming accomplices to something we'll regret later? Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. And if this story made you uncomfortable in the right way, share this video. Subscribe. Because the stories that show us how ordinary people enable extraordinary evil are the ones we need to remember most. The Reichsbank clerks turned wedding rings into gold bars and genocide into ledger entries. They were just doing their jobs. And that's exactly why their story matters.